Ilara Vance moved through the hushed opulence of the pinnacle with a practiced invisibility. At 21, she had mastered the art of being present but unseen, a ghost in a black apron gliding between tables laden with crystal and silver. Her sneakers, a quiet rebellion against the restaurant's suggestion of more elegant footwear, made no sound on the polished obsidian floors. The restaurant itself was an eagle's nest perched 70 floors above the glittering sprawl of New York City, a place where fortunes were made and unmade over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of wine that cost more than her monthly rent. Tonight the air was different. It was thick with the electric hum of a deal so large it seemed to bend the city's gravity around it. The Sterling family had booked the entire West Wing. Arthur Sterling, the patriarch, was a man carved from granite and ambition, his presence a palpable force field. He was celebrating the final acquisition that would swell his $2 billion real estate empire, Sterling Consolidated, into a titan that would cast a shadow across the continent. With him were his wife, Beatrice, a woman whose diamonds seemed to radiate a cold older than ice, and their son Tristan, a princeling of privilege whose smirk was his primary expression. Ilara's fingers, usually so steady as she balanced trays, felt a tremor of something cold and familiar. Not fear, but a coiled spring of readiness. She had served the Sterlings before. She knew their particular brand of casual cruelty, the way they looked through staff as if they were inconvenient pieces of furniture. But tonight was more than just another shift of enduring their disdain. Months of observation, of piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and discarded notes, had led her to believe that the glittering facade of Sterling Consolidated was as fragile as a pane of glass. And tonight, she felt the first hairline cracks beginning to show. She approached their table, a bottle of Chateau Petrus cradled in her arm like a newborn. The wine alone was worth 6 months of her grandmother's nursing home fees. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a low, respectful murmur. Tristan didn't look up from his phone. "Just pour the wine, girl. We don't need the life story." A few of the investors at the table, men with soft hands and predatory smiles, offered weak chuckles. Beatrice waved a dismissive hand, her rings catching the light. "And do try not to spill. This is a Xenia suit. It costs more than your education." Ilara's face remained a placid mask, but inside her mind was working, cataloging. It was a unique and burdensome gift, her memory. She never forgot a face, a name, or a number. It wasn't just remembering, it was seeing the connections, the patterns that lay hidden in plain sight. She could recall the exact seating arrangement from the Sterling's visit 3 months ago, the nervous tick of the junior associate who had dropped a folder, and the sequence of numbers on the document he'd hastily scooped up. It was a skill that had once promised her a scholarship to MIT, a future in quantitative analysis, before her grandmother's sudden illness had forced her to drop out and take the first job that could pay the bills. Now her powerful mind was used to remember who wanted their steak medium rare and who was allergic to shellfish. She poured the wine with a surgeon's precision, the dark liquid swirling into the glasses without a single wasted drop. As she moved around the table, her ears sifted through the conversational chaff, catching the wheat. They spoke of Project Nightingale, the final piece of the merger. Arthur Sterling was boasting, his voice a low rumble of absolute confidence. "Nightingale solidifies our coastal dominance. Once the ink is dry tonight, our valuation will be untouchable." Ilara's mind snagged on the name. Project Nightingale. She had seen it before, scribbled on a cocktail napkin left behind by another Sterling executive weeks ago, next to a string of numbers that hadn't made sense at the time. A project code NG-2B. Now, hearing the name spoken aloud, the number flashed in her memory with perfect clarity. Her focus was broken by Tristan snapping his fingers, a sound that cracked through the refined ambiance like a whip. "You, waitress, my napkin." He had let it slip from his lap, and it now lay by his polished Italian loafers. "Pick it up." It wasn't a request. It was a command, a test of subservience for the amusement of his audience. The investors watched, their faces expectant. Ilara felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. She had picked up napkins, forks, and the shattered pieces of egos for 2 years. But tonight, the casual humiliation felt different. It felt like a distraction, a deliberate piece of theater to keep people from looking too closely. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than a servant should. "Of course, sir." She bent down, her movements fluid and economical, and retrieved the linen square. But as she straightened up, her eyes didn't just see the napkin. They saw the edge of Arthur Sterling's leather briefcase, left slightly ajar on the floor beside his chair. Peeking from inside was a file folder, and on its tab, typed in neat block letters, she saw it. Project Nightingale Addendum, NG77M2B. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was the same code, but something was wrong. Her memory was churning, pulling up another fragment. A news article she'd read on her phone during her break. A small business report about a series of bankruptcies in coastal Oregon. A string of failed commercial developments, all linked to a subsidiary holding company no one had ever heard of. Oak Haven Ventures. And burned into her memory was the unique LLC registration number from that article. This was her curse and her gift. She didn't just remember things, she cross-referenced them at lightning speed. The numbers from the bankrupt Oak Haven Ventures, the project code on the napkin, and the file in Arthur Sterling's briefcase, they were all connected. It wasn't a solid foundation they were celebrating. It was a house of cards, and she was the only one in the room who could see it. She placed the napkin on the table beside Tristan's plate. Her hand was perfectly steady. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the seismic revelation that had just occurred in her mind. Tristan, annoyed by her unflappable composure, leaned back. "Yes. Tell us what a girl like you dreams about. Getting a big tip? Maybe buying a whole new pair of those shoes?" He gestured disdainfully toward her practical sneakers. The table laughed. It was a cruel, self-satisfied sound. But Ilara wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening to the frantic ticking of a clock only she could hear. The deal was closing tonight. The documents were on the table, and she was holding a truth that could shatter their $2 billion world. The question was, what could a waitress possibly do with it? She retreated from the table, her mind a whirlwind of numbers and possibilities. She saw Marcus Thorne sitting alone at a smaller table near the window. A regular, senior vice president at a rival firm, Sterling's primary competitor. He was always polite, always professional, and she had once seen him discreetly leave a $100 tip for a busboy who had been reamed out by his manager. He was a man who noticed things, a man who valued competence, but he was also a shark in a world of sharks. Would he listen to a waitress with a wild theory based on a few overheard numbers and a good memory? It was a long shot, a gamble that could get her fired, or worse. But then she thought of her grandmother, her quiet dignity in the face of a failing body, the endless medical bills that were slowly drowning Ilara in debt. She thought of the condescending laughter of the Sterlings, who lived in a world so far removed from her reality they might as well be on another planet. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she picked up a fresh water carafe. Her purpose was clear now. She was no longer just a waitress serving dinner. She was a silent arbiter, about to walk into the center of a billion-dollar battlefield, armed with nothing but a memory and a desperate, burning resolve. She began walking toward Marcus Thorne's table, each silent step on the obsidian floor a countdown to an explosion. Ilara glided toward Marcus Thorne's table, the crystal carafe in her hand feeling impossibly heavy. He was staring out at the city lights, a pensive look on his face, his fork idly pushing a piece of sea bass around his plate. He was in his late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a suit that was impeccably tailored but didn't scream for attention, like the Sterling's ostentatious attire. He was a predator, yes, but a quiet, patient one. As she approached, he looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew her not by name, but as the efficient waitress who never needed to write down an order, even for a table of 8. "More water, Mr. Thorne?" Ilara asked, her voice perfectly level. "Thank you," he said, gesturing to his glass. She poured the water, her movements practiced and smooth. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were rock steady. This was her one chance. She had to choose her words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. "It's quite a celebration tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her back mostly to the Sterling party. Marcus gave a non-committal shrug. Arthur Sterling always finds a reason to celebrate himself. The Nightingale acquisition is just his latest excuse to command a room. His tone was dry, tinged with a professional rivalry that bordered on disdain. This was her opening. "Project Nightingale," she murmured as if to herself. "An interesting name for a coastal development portfolio." Marcus's eyes sharpened. He stopped pushing his fish around and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "How would you know the name of the project?" Ilara kept her gaze focused on the water glass she was filling. "This room has excellent acoustics if you know how to listen, and I've always been good with details. For example, the project's internal code, NG-772B. She saw his knuckles whiten slightly where he gripped his fork. She had his full attention now. He knew that project codes were proprietary, not something a waitress should be able to recite. "That's, specific," he said slowly, his voice low and cautious. "What's your point?" "My point, Mr. Thorne," she said, straightening up and finally meeting his gaze, "is that I'm also good with numbers. And I read the financial news. I read about a shell company called Oakhaven Ventures that recently declared a string of catastrophic bankruptcies up and down the Oregon coast. Total write-off. Toxic assets." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. Marcus's face had become an impassive mask, but his eyes were drilling into her, calculating, processing. "A great number of LLCs file for bankruptcy every day," he stated, testing her. "True," Ilara conceded, "but not many of them have a corporate registration number that, when you cross-reference the state filings, shares a digital timestamp and a signatory agent with a dormant holding company that Sterling Consolidated acquired for pennies on the dollar 18 months ago. A holding company that was then used to purchase the portfolio that became Project Nightingale." The silence that followed was profound. She had laid her cards on the table. She had taken a lifetime of absorbing random data, a news article here, an overheard number there, a glimpse of a document, and synthesized it into a single, devastating conclusion. Arthur Sterling hadn't acquired a valuable asset. He had acquired a mountain of debt and failure, hidden it within the labyrinth of his own corporate structure, and was now using the announcement of the acquisition to inflate his company's stock price before the truth came out. He wasn't closing a deal. He was running a con. Marcus Thorne slowly placed his fork down on his plate. The quiet clink of silver against porcelain sounded like a gavel. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a hushed, intense whisper. "My name is Ilara Vance. I'm a student of quantitative analysis, currently on an extended leave of absence. And I am the person who serves the Sterlings their overpriced wine while they brag about their crimes." From across the room, Tristan's grating laugh cut through the air. He had dropped his fork and was now pointing at it on the floor. "Waitress! Service!" he called out, his voice slurring slightly from the expensive wine. "Are you deaf or just incompetent?" Ilara didn't even flinch. Her eyes remained locked on Marcus. "They think I'm invisible," she said softly. "They're about to find out how wrong they are. That deal is being signed tonight, on fraudulent pretenses. The investors at that table believe they are buying into a secure future. What they're really buying is a lie." Marcus leaned forward, his professional mask cracking, to reveal the hungry shark beneath. He was skeptical, of course, but the specificity of her information was staggering. An anonymous tip could be dismissed, but a detailed allegation involving registration numbers and signatory agents? That was actionable. "This is an incredible accusation," he said. "If you're right, this goes far beyond a bad business deal. This is securities fraud on a massive scale. If you're wrong, my career is over for even listening to you, and Sterling's lawyers will crush you into dust. Check the Oakhaven Ventures bankruptcy filings against Sterling's Q3 acquisitions from last year," she replied instantly, the information flowing from her memory without hesitation. "Look for a holding company called Pacific Rim Equities. It's a ghost, but the digital paper trail is there. I'm sure a man in your position has the resources to verify that in minutes." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, a complex battle of caution and ambition playing out across his face. He saw the unwavering certainty in her eyes, the fierce intelligence that burned beneath her nondescript uniform. She wasn't just a disgruntled employee, she was a loaded weapon. Helping her was a colossal risk. But if she was right, the fall of Sterling Consolidated would create a power vacuum so immense that his own firm could rise to fill it. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, delivered to him on a silver platter by an unassuming waitress. He subtly pulled out his phone beneath the table, his thumb flying across the screen as he sent a coded message to his firm's forensic accounting team. The message was simple: urgent, verify connection, Oakhaven Ventures, Pacific Rim Equities, SC, highest priority. He looked back up at Alara. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice grim. "If my people can't find a whisper of what you're talking about, you disappear. I never spoke to you. You are a ghost. Understood?" "Understood," Alara said. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Tristan's voice was louder now, laced with genuine anger at being ignored. He stood up, weaving slightly, and started walking towards them. "What could possibly be so interesting over here? Are you trying to poach our waitress, Thorne? Find your own." The confrontation was coming, whether she was ready or not. Tristan was a spoiled child used to getting his way, and his fragile ego had been pricked. He was closing in, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. Alara took a half-step back from Marcus's table, turning to face Tristan, placing herself between the two men. She was no longer a servant receding into the background. She was a shield, buying Marcus the precious seconds he needed. "I'm sorry for the delay, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I was just about to retrieve your fork." "The hell you were," Tristan sneered, his eyes flicking between her and Marcus. "You were whispering with him. What about? Telling him how we don't tip enough?" He was close now, invading her personal space, his breath soured with wine. "Or maybe you were offering him something extra. Is that how you make your real money?" The insult, crude in public, was designed to shatter her composure, to reduce her to a humiliated, weeping mess. The investors at the Sterling's table were watching, some with amusement, others with a hint of discomfort. Arthur Sterling watched with cold detachment, making no move to rein in his son. Beatrice looked down at her plate as if the scene were beneath her notice, which was somehow the most insulting reaction of all. Alara stood her ground. The heat of shame and anger washed over her, but she forced it down, converting it into fuel. She could feel Marcus's phone vibrate on the table behind her. The message had come through. The 5 minutes were up. Her entire future, her grandmother's care, everything hung on what that message said. She met Tristan's cruel, arrogant gaze. Her own eyes, which he had never bothered to truly look into, were as clear and cold as glacial ice. She was done being invisible. She was done being their plaything. "No, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice no longer a deferential murmur, but a clear, resonant tone that carried through the suddenly quiet restaurant. "I wasn't. We were discussing numbers, specifically the value of honesty." Tristan scoffed, readying another verbal volley, but he never got the chance to deliver it. Behind her, Marcus Thorne stood up. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of shock and predatory excitement. He held his phone in his hand. The screen lit up. He looked past Alara, his gaze locking directly onto Arthur Sterling. "Arthur," Marcus said, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "I think you and I need to have a conversation, right now, about Project Nightingale and about a bankrupt little company called Oakhaven Ventures." The name spoken aloud hit the Sterling table like a physical blow. Arthur Sterling's confident facade fractured, a hairline crack of pure panic appearing in his stony expression. The investors swiveled in their chairs, their faces morphing from amusement to alarm. Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Tristan looked from Marcus to his father, his drunken bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. The dominoes had started to fall, and Alara Vance, the invisible waitress, was the one who had just kicked over the first one. The pinnacle, 70 floors in the sky, suddenly felt like the edge of a very, very long drop. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, a vacuum created by the detonation of Marcus Thorne's words. Every diner, every staff member, was frozen, their attention locked on the drama unfolding between the two tables. The name Oakhaven Ventures hung in the air, an indictment that needed no explanation for the men at the Sterling table. Their faces told the story. The flush of excitement on the investors' faces had turned to a waxy, sickly pallor. They weren't just guests at a celebration anymore. They were potential witnesses at a crime scene. Arthur Sterling was the first to recover, his years of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers providing him with a veneer of control, however thin. He rose slowly from his chair, a king whose throne was beginning to crumble beneath him. His eyes, cold and reptilian, bypassed Marcus and fixed directly on Alara. He understood instantly. This wasn't a corporate leak from a rival. The attack had come from a place he had never even thought to guard. "You," he said, the single word dripping with a venomous disbelief. "What have you done?" Before Alara could answer, Tristan, his mind finally catching up to the disaster, lunged at her. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a primal scream of entitlement denied. "You miserable little nobody," he roared, his hands reaching for her. "You ruined everything." Marcus Thorne moved with surprising speed, stepping between Tristan and Alara, his arm blocking Tristan's advance. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Tristan," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. "Assaulting a key witness in a federal fraud investigation is generally frowned upon." Key witness. The phrase echoed through the room, elevating Alara from a simple waitress to something far more significant and far more protected. Tristan froze, his rage momentarily checked by a new, unfamiliar sensation. Fear. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp, her manicured hand flying to her throat. "Arthur, do something," she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "This is insane. She's a servant." But Arthur's attention was still locked on Alara. He saw past the apron and the worn sneakers. He saw the sharp, analytical mind and the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He had made the classic mistake of the powerful. He had underestimated the people he deemed insignificant. "This is a lie," Arthur boomed, his voice regaining some of its commanding force as he addressed his investors. "A desperate attempt by a competitor to sabotage a landmark deal. This girl is clearly a plant, paid by Thorne to spread these baseless slanders." One of the investors, a heavy-set man named Peterson, who had been the most enthusiastic about the deal, stood up. "Is it baseless, Arthur? Oakhaven? I've heard whispers about that portfolio for months. You told us it was clean. You told us the assets were AAA rated." "And they are," Arthur insisted, but the sweat beating on his forehead betrayed him. It was then that Alara spoke, her voice cutting through his bluster. It wasn't loud, but it was clear and precise, each word a carefully placed stone that would build a wall he could not climb. "They are not," she said, looking directly at Peterson. "The assets under Oakhaven Ventures, now bundled into Project Nightingale under the code NG772B, consist of 17 commercial properties, 12 of which are currently in foreclosure. 3 are designated brownfield sites requiring millions in environmental cleanup, and the remaining 2 have liens against them from unpaid contractors. The entire portfolio has a net liability of over $90 million. You weren't acquiring an asset, sir. You were acquiring Sterling Consolidated's toxic debt, gift-wrapped as a prime investment." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer, irrefutable detail of her statement was more powerful than any shouted accusation. It was the kind of data no paid plant could invent on the spot. It was the truth. The investors began to murmur, a low, angry hum that grew in volume. They were pulling out their own phones now, frantically texting their own teams, their own analysts. They had been played, and the realization was dawning on them with sickening speed. Arthur Sterling took a step toward Alara, his face a mask of pure fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You are a child who clears plates for a living. You will be hearing from my lawyers. We will destroy you. We will take everything you have." Alara's chin lifted. A sad, tired smile touched her lips. "Everything I have, Mr. Sterling. I have a grandmother in a second-rate nursing home, a mountain of debt, and a pair of comfortable shoes. You, on the other hand, are about to lose a $2 billion empire. So you tell me, who has more to lose right now?" The raw, unvarnished truth of her statement seemed to suck the air from his lungs. He had no leverage over her. His usual weapons, money, power, intimidation, were useless against someone who had nothing left to take. Just then, Marcus Thorne's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. A small, grim smile played on his lips. He looked up at Arthur. "It seems my sources were faster than yours, Arthur," he said. "The SEC just received a rather detailed anonymous tip. They're filing an emergency injunction to halt the merger and freeze all of Sterling Consolidated's primary assets pending an investigation." He turned his phone so Arthur could see the headline from a financial news alert that had just broken. Sterling Consolidated faces fraud allegations. To be merger halted. The screen acted as a death certificate. The color drained completely from Arthur Sterling's face. He staggered back, clutching the edge of the table for support. His empire, his legacy, his life's work, all of it had crumbled, not in a boardroom, not from a hostile takeover, but in seconds because of the quiet observations of a waitress he had never bothered to see. Beatrice, the sound that followed was not the expected explosion of outrage, but its opposite, a profound, all-consuming silence. It was the sound of a vacuum being created, of a reality collapsing in on itself. A fork, loosened from an investor's nerveless fingers, clattered onto a plate with a sound like a gunshot in a cathedral. Beatrice Sterling's perfectly painted lips parted in a small, round O of disbelief, a silent scream. Every eye was fixed not on Marcus, the accuser, or Arthur, the accused, but on Alara. She was no longer a ghost in an apron. She was the epicenter. The gravity of the room had indeed bent, and she was its new, quiet, terrifying center. Arthur Sterling rose, his movements stiff, as if he were wading through molasses. His face, usually a ruddy mask of power and privilege, had become a canvas of gray ash. He did not see the terrified faces of his investors or the predatory gleam in Marcus Thorne's eyes. He saw only Alara, and in her calm, unblinking gaze, he saw the reflection of his own ruin. It was the quiet condemnation in her eyes that finally broke him. "This is absurd," he began, but the legendary baritone that had crushed rivals and swayed boards had been reduced to a dry rasp. "This is corporate espionage. This girl is a plant." He gestured toward her, a dismissive flick of the wrist that lacked all its former authority. Tristan, jolted from his wine-fueled haze into a nightmare, finally reacted. It was a purely instinctual response, the lashing out of a cornered animal. "You lying little bitch," he snarled, shoving back his chair and lunging toward her, his face contorted with a confusion so deep it had curdled into rage. "My father built this city. You're nothing." Marcus moved with an economist's precision, not a step wasted, intercepting Tristan with a solid forearm to the chest. "Tristan, stop," he said, his voice low and laced with steel. "There are men who will be arriving shortly who are paid a great deal of money to deal with this sort of behavior. I suggest you sit down before you add assault of a federal witness to your family's growing list of problems." The term hung in the air, glittering and sharp, federal witness. It was a shield and a coronation. It instantly and irrevocably changed Alara's status from a disgruntled waitress to a protected asset of the state. Tristan recoiled as if burned, his rage dissolving into a pale, gaping fear. It was Alara who spoke next, her voice perfectly pitched to carry across the silent, cavernous room. She wasn't addressing Arthur or Tristan. She was speaking to the investors, the men whose fortunes now hung by a thread she had so carefully unraveled. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her eyes finding the heavy-set man who had seemed so eager to toast his new partnership. "Before you signed tonight, did Mr. Sterling disclose the full liability reports from the Oak Haven portfolio? Did he mention the EPA fines pending on the brownfield sites in Astoria? Or the class action lawsuit filed by the subcontractors in Tillamook County for non-payment? A suit directly tied to Oak Haven's parent LLC? Each question was a surgical incision, delivered without malice, but with a devastating precision that laid the fraud bare. She wasn't throwing accusations. She was presenting data points, and the men at the table understood the language of data. They looked at Arthur, not with anger yet, but with the cold, dead eyes of sharks who realize they are the ones bleeding in the water. Arthur Sterling opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his son, whose pathetic bravado had collapsed, and at his wife, who was staring at her diamond bracelet as if she had never seen it before. He looked at the empire around him, the priceless view, the crystal, the silver, the men he had courted and conquered, and he understood that it was all gone. It had been undone by a series of numbers he had deemed too insignificant to properly bury, numbers that had been collected and collated by a mind he had deemed too insignificant to notice. Marcus Thorne's phone lit up with a soft chime. He held it up, not triumphantly, but with the dispassionate air of an undertaker confirming a death. "Bloomberg," he announced to the room, "the SEC has frozen trading on Sterling Consolidated, pending a formal investigation into securities fraud. It seems my anonymous tip was corroborated rather quickly." He looked at Arthur. "It's over." The dam of civility finally broke. The investors scrambled, a cacophony of panicked voices shouting into phones. "Short it! Liquidate my position now! I want out! I don't care about the loss!" It was the sound of rats deserting a ship that was not just sinking, but had already hit the ocean floor. Amidst the chaos, two men and a woman in impeccably tailored, sober suits entered the restaurant. They moved with a quiet purpose that cut through the panic, their eyes scanning the room and landing on the Sterling family. SEC. Their arrival was the final punctuation mark on the end of an era. As they approached, Arthur Sterling sagged into his chair, a puppet with its strings cut. Beatrice began to weep, not the silent, dignified tears of a matriarch, but the ugly, gulping sobs of a woman calculating the loss of her couture, her charity luncheons, her place in society. Tristan just stood there, a ghost at his own funeral, watching the foundations of his world turn to dust. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The adrenaline that had sharpened her thoughts and steadied her voice was draining away, leaving a hollow, ringing exhaustion. She had won. The giant was dead. But victory felt less like a fiery triumph and more like the cold, quiet emptiness after a storm. She reached behind her back and with numb fingers untied the strings of her apron. The simple black fabric felt impossibly heavy, a relic from a life that had ended only minutes ago. She folded it into a neat square and placed it on the corner of Marcus's table. A resignation, a declaration. Marcus watched the gesture, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Stay here," he commanded softly, before striding over to intercept the lead SEC agent, presenting his card and drawing them into a hushed, intense conference. Ilara was left alone in the eye of the hurricane. The restaurant manager, Mr. Dubois, approached her, his face a mask of bewildered terror. "Miss Vance, What?" He couldn't form a sentence. "I believe I'm finished for the night, Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He could only nod, his authority utterly stripped away. She walked away from the wreckage, her sneakers making no sound on the obsidian floor. She didn't look back at the weeping wife or the catatonic son. She felt a sudden, desperate need for open air, but as she reached the grand entrance, a hand gently touched her arm. It was Marcus. The SEC agents were now talking to Arthur, their voices low and professional, the bureaucratic gears of justice beginning to grind. "A word, Ms. Vance," he said, guiding her to a quiet alcove away from the main exit. The city glittered below them, a sprawling circuit board of light and ambition, utterly indifferent to the corporate death that had just occurred 70 floors above it. "You'll be questioned," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. "They'll need your testimony. It will be a media circus. Your face will be everywhere. You need protection. Not from the Sterlings. They're finished. But from the process itself. It eats people alive." He took out a slim, platinum card case. He didn't offer her his own card. Instead, he pulled out a different one and wrote a number on the back with a silver pen. "Elizabeth Chen. She's a barracuda in a Chanel suit. She will make sure you are treated as the asset you are, not as a piece of collateral damage. Tell her I sent you. My firm will handle her retainer." Ilara looked from the card to his face. "Why?" she asked, the question raw and genuine. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a deep, unsettling vulnerability. "You have what you wanted. You've won." Marcus's expression shifted. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the corporate predator slipped, revealing something more complex beneath. What I wanted was to neutralize a competitor who was playing a rigged game. What I found was a weapon I didn't know existed. He met her eyes, his gaze intense and analytical. I've spent 30 years and hundreds of millions of dollars on quantitative analysts, forensic accountants, and data miners, all trying to do what you did tonight with a memory and a tray of wine glasses. You didn't just find a discrepancy, Miss Vance. You saw a hidden system. You saw the architecture of a lie. That is not a skill. That is a gift of immense and, frankly, terrifying value. He gestured out at the city. That world out there, it runs on information. Most people see the buildings. They see the lights. You see the code running underneath. Sterling's fall will create a power vacuum. My firm intends to fill it. But to do so, we have to sift through the rubble he left behind. His entire company is a crime scene, and I suspect Project Nightingale is just the room where the body was found. There are others. He slid the card into her hand. Her fingers closed around it. It felt cool and solid. Real. Elizabeth will draft a contract for you, he continued. A consultant position with our forensic auditing division. You'll be looking for more Oakhaven ventures. The pay will be enough to solve your immediate problems, and then some. He named a figure that was so far beyond her reality that it sounded like a foreign language. But the money is secondary. We're offering you a laboratory, a place where your gift will be understood, honed, and aimed at targets far larger than the Sterling family. Or, he added, his voice dropping slightly, you can take a generous finder's fee, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and disappear. The choice is yours. He stepped back, giving her space. He had laid out the options with the clarity of a stock prospectus. There was no sentiment, no pity. It was a business proposition. He was offering her a chance to weaponize her own mind. She looked down at the card in her hand, then back up at him. She thought of her grandmother, of the cloying smell of disinfectant in the nursing home, of the endless, soul-crushing bills. Then she thought of the thrill she had felt as the pieces clicked into place in her mind, the sense of absolute clarity, of seeing the truth of a thing when everyone else was blind. It was the most alive she had ever felt. I won't be a ghost in your machine, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice quiet but firm. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine expression she had ever seen from him. I'm not hiring a ghost, Miss Vance, he replied. I'm hiring the architect. 3 months later, Elara stood in a room filled with light. It didn't smell of disinfectant or despair, but of lemon polish and blooming orchids. Sunlight streamed through a large bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her grandmother was asleep in a comfortable high-backed chair, a soft cashmere blanket tucked around her legs. Her breathing was even and peaceful. This was the Willows, a place Elara had only ever read about in glossy magazines. Now it was her grandmother's home. The first check from her consulting contract had been signed over to them without a moment's hesitation. It was the first debt she had ever paid that made her feel richer. Her life was now a study in contrast. By day, she was submerged in the digital catacombs of Sterling Consolidated. She worked in a secure, windowless office known as the Vault, with a small team of veteran auditors. They had treated her with suspicion at first, this young woman with no credentials who had been given unprecedented access. But that suspicion had quickly turned to awe. She didn't just follow paper trails, she sensed them. She could feel the wrongness in a data set, the slight anomaly in a string of code that signified a hidden door. She found 2 more Nightingale projects buried in offshore accounts, saving the new consortium hundreds of millions and leading to a fresh wave of indictments. She wasn't a ghost in the machine. She was its most sensitive diagnostic tool. The nights were harder. She would wake up in her new quiet apartment, her heart pounding, the echo of Tristan's sneering voice, or the sight of Arthur's collapsing face replaying in her mind. The weight of her actions was a physical presence in the dark. She had destroyed a family. She had vaporized the jobs of thousands of innocent employees caught in the blast radius of Arthur's fraud. Elizabeth Chen, who had become a fierce mentor as much as a lawyer, had been blunt with her. Power is a burden, Elara. You used yours to expose a rot that would have eventually collapsed and taken far more people with it. You didn't start the fire. You just pointed the fire hose at it. Stop trying to carry the ashes. It was good advice, but hard to follow. One crisp December evening, she was walking home, her mind still churning through a complex web of shell corporations. As she passed a small, independent coffee shop, she saw a familiar figure sitting at an outdoor table, nursing a single cup of coffee. It was Tristan. He looked diminished. The expensive tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark pea coat. The arrogant posture had been replaced by a weary slump. The smirk that had been his permanent accessory was gone, leaving his face looking unguarded and surprisingly young. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was just staring into the middle distance, watching the city rush by. Her first instinct was to turn and walk away, to avoid the confrontation, but something held her there. This was the last ghost, the final piece of the story that felt unfinished. She took a breath and walked over to his table. "Mr. Sterling," she said. He looked up, and for a moment there was a flicker of the old anger, a reflexive flash of resentment, but it died as quickly as it came, replaced by a profound, hollowed-out weariness. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "It's just Tristan now," he said, his voice quiet. "The Mr. Sterling account has been closed." She sat. The silence between them was thick with unspoken things. "I see you on the news sometimes," he said finally, tracing the rim of his paper cup. "They call you the pinnacle witness. Makes you sound like a superhero." He attempted a laugh, but it came out as a dry, broken sound. "They don't mention the part where my mother had a breakdown and is now living with her sister in Palm Beach, or that my father's trial is set for April. He'll die in prison." Alara didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt like a lie. He deserved it, felt cruel, so she remained silent. "The funny thing is," Tristan continued, looking at her directly for the first time, "I hated him. I hated living under his shadow, hated that nothing I ever did was good enough. I spent my whole life wanting to be free of him." He shook his head, a gesture of bleak irony. "And now I am. All our assets are frozen. The lawyers took the cars, the houses, everything. I'm living in a one-bedroom rental in Queens. I have a job, an actual job. I'm a junior sales associate for a catering supply company." He looked at his hands, which were no longer the soft, manicured hands of a princeling. There were calluses forming on his palms. "I just wanted to ask you one thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That night. Why? Was it revenge? Because I was an ass to you? I know I was. I was an ass to everyone. It was the only way I knew how to be." Ilara thought for a long moment. She looked at this broken man and felt not triumph, not pity, but a strange, clarifying peace. The anger she had held for so long had been a fuel, but she didn't need it anymore. "No," she said honestly. "It wasn't about revenge. Not really." She leaned forward slightly. "You and your father, you saw the world as a collection of people to be used. You looked at me and you saw a servant. You looked at your investors and you saw wallets. You looked at your companies and you saw assets to be bled dry. You never saw the system that held it all together. The numbers. The rules." She met his gaze and her own was clear and steady. "I don't see people like that. I see the system. And yours was broken. It was a lie. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because it was wrong. The numbers were wrong. And I can't not see that." He stared at her, and a flicker of understanding, painful and illuminating, dawned in his eyes. He was finally seeing her, not as a waitress, not as a nemesis, but as a force of nature he had never been equipped to comprehend. He finally understood that to her, he had never been the target. He was just a variable in a flawed equation. He nodded slowly. "The numbers were wrong," he repeated softly, as if it were a mantra he was just beginning to learn. He stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. "Well, good luck to you, Alara Vance." He walked away, melting into the anonymous river of the evening crowd. He didn't look back. Ilara sat there for a long time, the chill of the evening air on her face. The last ghost was gone. The scales were balanced. She stood up and continued her walk home, her practical sneakers making a quiet, steady rhythm on the pavement. She looked up at the skyscrapers soaring into the night sky. their windows like a million glowing pixels. She was no longer an outsider looking up at a world she couldn't touch. She saw it now for what it was, a vast, complex, beautiful system, a city of numbers, and she was finally speaking its language. The lights didn't mock her anymore. They were welcoming her home,